and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and it is time for the year's very last monthly reading wrap-up. In the month of December, I read a total of 9 books, which was a little more than I had originally planned. Indeed, I'd only planned on reading like 3 or 4 novels, but decided at the very last minute to add on to my December TBR a few graphic rereads. December was mostly devoted to rereading novels and all graphic novels / comic books. One of the graphic reads was an original read, and one of the novels was also an original read, though it's a special case, which I'll talk a bit more in depth at the very end of the video. Otherwise, just rereads. And first, I'll go through the graphic books I read, and then we'll move on to the novels. So first I read this, the Book of Mythical Beasts and Magical Creatures. It's one of these anthologies about a subject published by this. I have one about feminism, I have one about mythology. I think this one is really meant for much younger readers, like young children. This caught my eye originally because of the illustrations. They're very pretty illustrations. Things like this. It's very colourful. It showcases lots of different mythological creatures from different folklores, mythologies from around the world, and it was nice, but it really is meant for children. And I did spot a few, maybe not outright mistakes, but inaccuracies and oversimplifications, which I guess is fine for very small children, but as a huge mythology nerd, I also want children to be introduced to correct information about mythology and folklore, so I'm not sure it's quite a good enough, excuse for that. But otherwise, yeah, it was enjoyable, but I'm definitely not the target audience with the knowledge I already have about mythology, folklore, mythical beasts, etc. So I also reread Tamara de Lempicka, which I first read like a couple of months ago, or in September, I can't remember exactly. This is a bande dessinée, so very short comic book graphic novel about the artist Tamara de Lempicka. I had enjoyed it reasonably the first time I read it, and my appreciation of this, my rating, didn't change at all. It was still interesting enough, though I really am left with the feeling that this person from history merited a much more thorough and in-depth, not novelization, but graphic novelization of her life and work, a bit like Anaïs Nin or Baudelaire, which I'm going to get to in a few seconds. So it was an enjoyable, very, very quick reread. And so yes, I also reread Mademoiselle Baudelaire by Yslaire, which is a biographical graphic novel about the French poet Charles Baudelaire. Still excellent. The rating didn't change here either. It was still very solid 8 to 8.5 out of 10, going pretty in depth about the life of this poet, and more specifically his relationship to his muse and lover, who was this mixed-race woman named Jeanne Duval. There's a lot of passion in there, and violent feelings and conflicted feelings and descent into madness and melancholia. It's a beautiful graphic novel, but quite dark, which fits Charles Baudelaire to a T. So I would definitely strongly recommend this one, as I already did in whichever monthly reading wrap-up I mentioned this previously. Then I reread something I first read a much, much longer time ago, probably somewhere near 15 years ago now. It's this, Merlin. Now, this is not quite a graphic novel. This is basically an art book. It's mostly illustrations with a bit of narrative text attached to each page, and it retells the Arthurian legend, specifically focusing on Merlin and taking the angle of Merlin having been a druid, training in Avalon, and so definitely anchoring the Arthurian mythos in Celtic or Romano-Celtic history and culture, that general vibe, which is definitely the spin I prefer regarding the Arthurian mythos. It's a magnificent art book. This is to give you a general idea of the art style. They're just these beautiful double-paged illustrations, narrative illustrations. It's a story I know very well, but it's just the power of the imagery really hit me when I first read this when I was, well, I don't know, 15, 16 years old. And I'm happy I took the time to really go through it again slowly and absorb that powerful imagery. It really is beautiful, so definitely confident in keeping this preciously in my library, and I don't think you can easily find a copy of this anymore today, but if you can, if you speak French, even if you don't really, just for the illustrations, honestly, I would highly recommend this. And then I reread Anaïs Nin Sur la mer des mensonges, written and illustrated by Léonie Bischoff, and this is also most definitely still one of my favorite graphic novels of all time. The illustrations are just drop dead gorgeous. I was still very moved by the story of Anaïs Nin, or at least the creative spin the author put on it, because I also reread Henry and June, so I have a few comments about that, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. I don't know, something about this just really moves me, and I find it powerful and visceral, also difficult at times. There's a lot of things in there I can relate to personally, some I definitely can't, and that's a good thing I might add. But also just the art style. Some of those pages are just filled with gut-punching illustrations and sensual, voluptuous imagery. I can't but recommend this graphic novel. Moving on to the fiction now, so I also read in the first week of December Putney by Sofka Zinovieff. I kind of wanted to round out the year with something I'd started the year with, which was Putney. It's the very first novel I finished in 2021. It's not technically the very last thing I read in 2021, but close enough. And well, this was still more than a bit of a punch to the gut, to the heart as well. I still thoroughly enjoyed it, even though enjoyed is not the right verb here, but you get my meaning. I hope my rating hasn't changed either. It's still a great, what I call Lily the Responsive narrative, or, grooming narrative. I think the author did a brilliant job exploring the psychologies of her different main characters, including the victim and the predator. And weirdly enough, it actually hurt a bit more reading it this time around. I mean, I say weirdly enough, but I think I know why. I basically started reading this, or I wasn't that far into it, and I kind of had an anxiety attack or meltdown reading it, so that was interesting and unexpected. Otherwise, I was perfectly fine reading this. But yes, my emotional reaction was somehow a bit more intense this time, but I'm so happy I reread it. I'm happy it's in my library. I would definitely recommend it with all the obvious warnings attached. The second reread of December was L'Enchanteur, written by René Barjavel. The first time I read this was in my third year of secondary school, so I was probably 15 years old, so this dates back a while. This is also a French language retelling of the Arthurian mythos, focusing purportedly on Merlin and then his relationship with Vivian, his love interest. But this was a big flop for me. I'm like, why did I like this when I was 15? I actually know sort of why I liked it. Not good reasons, and I will not go into them, but this was not good at all. I didn't particularly like the writing, which mixed a very formal style and a very familiar, even vulgar style with words which I felt didn't fit into the era of the Arthurian legend. It sounded so weird to me. There's a random, zapping in of a supermarket into, the 12th century by Merlin to give food to this village, which it felt so freaking clumsy. And there's this general motif of Merlin acting like a buffoon to make others laugh, but at the same time he's supposed to be the super wise figure leading everyone on the Grail quest. Now this is the kind of Arthurian retelling which definitely takes a more Christian focus or mantle upon itself, which fine, it's not my preference, but fine, though it does acknowledge pagan deities as well, and Druidism in a way, but it's, I don't know, it wasn't terribly convincing, but fine. The female characterization is absolute garbage. The writing, the commentary around sex, around virginity, was god's awful. I'm sorry, this is a major spoiler, but I really can't be asked not to say this. There's this whole recurring leitmotif that Merlin and Vivian cannot consummate their burning love for one another because it would nix their magical powers, but you never really get an explanation as to why that is, and I was like, aight. And this is the other thing. You have this central passion. You're supposed to believe it's this great passion, this great love story between Merlin and Vivian. One, Merlin falls in love with Vivian when she's 12, 13, which is a bit iffy, but fine. And then it rests on nothing. They're just wildly in love with one another. It's not even so much insta-love, it's just love built out of thin air. There is no concrete explanation or development given to the relationship between Merlin and Vivian. If anything, it focuses a lot on physical appearance and physical beauty, which talk about superficial, but sure, if you want to go with that. And it's this weird stringing up of these different little events that you can find in different versions of the Arthurian mythos, all sort of circling around this idea of the quest for the Holy Grail, but it just felt so loose-knit. It didn't amount to a unified narrative, it just felt like a string of events that you kind of follow along with. I was like, I don't care about anything. However, I did read through this very, very, very quickly, again because I just wanted to be done with it past a certain point, so I will not be keeping this in my library. At least I'm settled on this now. I will be giving this away to a secondhand bookstore, just to make a clean break with it, and the weirder negative associations I still have with this, so yeah. In the last week of December, I reread Henry and June, written by Anaïs Nin. The first time I read this, I think, was in 2013. At least that's what I apparently wrote down on my Goodreads. Well, I'm not sure about that. So maybe, maybe not. But it was a few years ago now, in any case. This is not a novel. It's not a memoir either. It's basically excerpts taken from some of the diaries that Anaïs Nin kept. She was a very, very, very prolific diarist. And these excerpts revolve around her meeting author Henry Miller and his wife June Mansfield. And then the relationship she developed with Henry Miller and June, though to a much lesser extent, it really mostly focuses on her affair with Henry Miller and then her relationships to her husband, to her cousin Eduardo, to her psychoanalyst, which you also learn about in the graphic novel Anaïs Nin sur la mer des mensonges. In fact, it was interesting to find some of the events and even quotes in Henry and June present in Anaïs Nin sur la mer des mensonges. So Léonie Bischoff really obviously did her research for her graphic novel. So definitely points for that as well. It's not very long, it's like 200 pages. I read this, again, reasonably quickly. I gave this a 6.5 out of 10. I cannot remember at all the rating I would have given this, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago now. I enjoyed some bits of this. I mostly, though, found it interesting. I found it interesting because as basically a diary, it gives you a very intimate look into the psyche of another person. And it does this to an even greater degree than something like a memoir would, in my opinion. Now, the thing is, Anaïs Nin, and she admits this herself, as she's writing in her diary, she lied a lot about what she wrote in her diaries. She fictionalized a lot of her own life and embellished a lot of the things she experienced or felt. And it also appeared to me that she was a very fragmented and ambivalent person, or I mean, her character was very fragmented, which you do get a sense of in the graphic novel, but it's a lot more obvious here. I get the feeling that this is a woman who took a much longer time than someone like me, for example, to find herself or to get a firm understanding of her own personality, identity, things like that, which at times I found frustrating because it's not something I can relate to. And it wasn't even a function of her being really young, because she wrote the diary from which this is taken when she was like my age, so 30 years old or thereabouts. And that was sometimes a bit confusing for me, but fine, still interesting from a purely human psychology perspective, I suppose. Where I thought she really shined, though, is her writing about sensuality, about sexual desire, about love, though even there, a lot of the times, she seemed very confused to me, mixing up desire, love, lust, tenderness. Like, at times she says tenderness and love are incompatible. Now, maybe that's a thing for some people, but I just cannot relate to that. I'm like, no, you have tenderness within love. So at times I didn't necessarily agree with her opinions about love or intimate relationships, because a lot of it is couched in language that has to do with domination, with reasonably traditional gender roles, which is also strange because she was not exactly super traditional gender-wise herself. She was a very creative person, quite assertive, or at least she becomes increasingly assertive as time goes by, and she has these very deep creative ambitions and aspirations, and she definitely feels very, very conflicted about that. But yeah, there's a lot of language about power dynamics, submission, domination, not of a natural BDSM caliber either. At times I did find those comments, those reflections interesting and of a nature with which I could engage. but at times I also just fundamentally didn't agree with what she was saying, so I can relate to that. And then there's the whole psychoanalysis spiel, because she goes to see a psychoanalyst, and it's like very traditional Freudo-Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is still the main type of psychoanalysis in France today, and that has a lot to do with women assuming their natural submissive role and frigidity and the Oedipus complex and wanting to bang your parents and all that crap, which got pretty tedious after a while. And she falls for it to a certain extent, and so she tries to make sense of her relationships within that theoretical cadre, and it was just frustrating. But again, on the other hand, that beautiful language, those really evocative passages about lovemaking and about those deep, intense feelings she had for Henry Miller and the reciprocated feelings Henry Miller obviously had for her. It must have been a very special relationship they shared, which is what I had read, and that I could strongly relate to because personal experiences I'm currently living through. So I enjoyed that and could relate to that kind of intensity, that emotional intensity, that intensity of feeling, of connectedness to another human being. So that was very enjoyable. But yeah, it was a mixed bag basically. Still, I'm happy I reread this, especially since I also reread a graphic novel about this basically, so definitely not a waste of time by any means. For now, I'll keep it in my library. I am now curious to reread the actual erotic writing, but I don't know, maybe sometime next year. But so I did read one more thing in December. So Henry in June was the last thing I read this month. Before that, I read something on this. Yes, lo and behold, I now have a Kindle. I have now officially, not transitions because I'm definitely not abandoning printed books, but I have read an ebook and will be reading more ebooks in the future. This was an unexpected gift from a very special someone in my life, and I read this person's first novel. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but so yes, I basically beta read the third draft of a very dear friend's first novel. I hope to read the final draft next year and even do a review for this channel, though obviously it will be a fairly biased review, but more detail about that later. And I had a lot of fun doing that, actually, reading something written by someone very, very close to my heart, so a very positive experience, and I enjoyed the novel. It has, in my opinion, a lot of potential and is quite promising. It is something in the, broadly speaking, historical fantasy genre with a strong emphasis on romance, at least in the first novel, because it's a planned trilogy. So that is also something I read in December, and it was in ebook format, so it's the very first thing I read on my new Kindle, and I enjoyed it. I was a bit scared that I would have issue reading something digitally, but no, it was a very smooth experience, and I enjoyed some of the features of the Kindle. So going forwards, I shall now divide my TBR between physical copies and digital copies of books, which will be of great help to my finances and space management as well, and I'll be able to just select the very best for my physical library. Beyond reading, I also finished season 1 of The Wheel of Time TV adaptation. I was overall pretty underwhelmed by this first serving of this adaptation of one of the big chunky works of epic fantasy, but I have more thoughts about this in a dedicated video review if you want to check that out. I also took the time to watch the first season of Arcane. I did not do a review for that, but I'm just mentioning it here. I decided to watch that on a whim. I had zero expectations going in, and was pleasantly surprised. Like, it wasn't amazing, but it was enjoyable enough, and I really, really did enjoy the art style. I did not expect that at all. The animation style was quite cool, very aesthetically pleasing. I'd never seen anything like that before, and it has now basically made me realize that animation is a really solid avenue for adaptations, I think, going forward. I mean, this is like the first animated show for adults I've seen, like, properly done for adults. I mean, I guess, you know, teenagers can enjoy this as well, and you could make it even more adult if you wanted, but it's definitely meant for older audiences. I think you could do a lot of other things in SFF with that kind of medium, because, yeah, you can do neat things. Though some of the video game isms, is what I'm going to call them, did get a bit grating after a while, and yes, there's a lot of tropiness in there, but still, overall, I thought it was decently well done. I knew nothing about League of Legends going in, though my best friend has played League of Legends version, so I exchanged with him about this. It was kind of fun. But so yeah, I mean, I didn't care about that aspect. And so yeah, some of those video game isms felt a bit silly after a while, just a bit juvenile, but pleasant experience overall, and certainly wasn't expecting that. I also do want to mention, because I finally got to listen to a piano transcription of the main melodies of the Dune OST. This arrangement, was made by pianist Patrick Peachman. That arrangement is officially my music for 2021, or I mean, at least for the last bit of it, and the good feelings I've had these past couple of months. That music is amazing. I'm talking about it because I want as many people as possible to go listen to it. I just think it's freaking beautiful. It's definitely one of my top OSTs, or I mean my top piano OSTs of all time now. So that concludes my December reading wrap-up. Mostly, I enjoyed the rereads, both fiction and graphic fiction, so a decent month overall. And of course, I'll be doing my yearly reading wrap-up, and you can watch that in a couple of days as well if you wish. I hope you're all doing as well as you can. I hope you had a nice Christmas or whatever end of year festivities you enjoy. I wish you all a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer, and shall see you all in the next video, which will be the last one of the year. Until then, bye-bye.